Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Patros, and today I'm going to be giving a TED Talk on the importance of civility for change. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who once said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." I believe this quote applies more than ever in today's world, especially after the divide in our country that has occurred due to the recent 2024 election, as it was a very passionate one, and as a result, people have been in their feelings ever since. So, there have been certain movements since then that, while they may have started with good intentions or were good intentioned, they devolved into hate and violence because whether the people participating were motivated by chaos or the movement itself had evolved into one that revolves around chaos. So one example of this would be the 2025 LA riots, where they were motivated at first, I believe, by they didn't agree with the deportation efforts by the Trump administration, and as a result, they decided to go against ICE and their tactics and getting illegal immigrants out of our country. And the way they did this was in a very violent way, where they basically decided to destroy property. They threw bricks at law enforcement. They targeted businesses and looted them. It's very, very chaotic It was very chaotic in LA. And something similar was happening in Britain as well a few years ago, such as the Just Stop Oil protest, where the movement started out as, oh, they don't want Britain to use fossil fuels, as they wanted to protect the environment, but it eventually just evolved into people being obnoxious to the general populace, and they decided to sit in front of cars on the roads and block people from going to work, or even in some cases going to the hospital to give birth. It was pretty messed up there. And they also disrupted social and sports events, and they even went into different museums and desecrated works of art, such as one of Vincent van Gogh's paintings, as seen in one of Wesley Winter's YouTube videos on Just Stop Oil. So both of these movements involved not only destruction, but also a general feeling of obnoxiousness to the general populace. And as a result, they didn't really gain that much support, as people don't want to support movements who inhibit their daily lives. And that is why throughout history, peaceful movements were more successful in creating change, as they were able to rally people to their side. So one example of this would obviously be MLK Jr., Martin Luther King Jr., and the Civil Rights Movement, as it was one of the most influential movements in the history of America. So, according to the NAACP, Martin Luther King Jr., he rallied around the idea of peace instead of violence. And so, as Martin Luther King Jr. organized sit-ins and bus boycotts, they were attacked by law enforcement with pressurized water jets and attack dogs. And of course, it was horrible that they had to endure this violence. But since the civil rights movement was revolved around peace, and as people saw what was happening on national television, people became sympathetic to the cause and decided to support the civil rights movement. And this eventually led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was a big step for Black people in terms of freedom in America. So another prime example of this kind of nonviolent protest would be Mahatma Gandhi in India, who developed this sort of nonviolent non-cooperation known as Satyagraha. And so, similar to MLK Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, Gandhi incorporated these mass bus boycotts of British goods, as during the time Britain was India was subjected to British rule, and there have been multiple laws set in place by Britain where you can only buy British goods instead of being able to produce it locally. So what Gandhi did was he, along with many of his followers, went on what became known as the Salt March, and where Gandhi and his followers marched across the Arabian Sea, or marched along it, and decided to harvest salt instead of purchasing it from Britain. And so, through numerous other boycotts and other acts of civil disobedience, Gandhi was eventually able to take or make India independent of Britain as a result. So, from these 4 examples of both successful and unsuccessful protests, and both violent and non-violent protests, we can see what really leads to change, and that is peaceful protests. The reason that the LA riots and the Just Stop Oil protests were unsuccessful was because they rallied around this idea that disruption and violence would get what they wanted. So for the LA riots, there was no organization, really. It was more just chaos as they crowded the highways and the roads and looted businesses. For Just Stop Oil, they were organized in the fact that they were an organization, but they rallied around just being obnoxious to the general people instead of trying to have people sympathize with the cause and care about the environment. It made people not want to care about the environment because of how obnoxious they were. And even then, they were contradictory to their own words, as they used public transportation to get to the places they protested, or they used their own cars, and of course that leads to carbon emissions. So the people knew that they were contradictory to themselves. And so what MLK Jr. and Gandhi got right was playing into people's emotions and having their sympathy. They both knew, both Gandhi and MLK Jr., that they and their followers would have to suffer for their cause, and yet they organized their movement around that suffering. They knew that if they remained peaceful, people would eventually support them, as it is justice that always wins out in the end. So, as people saw where Gandhi and MLK Jr. were suffering because of the oppression that they had to endure, people decided to support them because they didn't think it was just, and because one side was clearly being more violent than the other. So, in the end, that is why that MLK Jr. and Gandhi, and both the civil rights movement and the movement to get India independent from Britain, was so successful, because they rallied around this idea of nonviolence and being peaceful and getting people to support them as a result. So as we can see throughout history, nonviolence has always been the key to have things change around the world. From MLK Jr. to Gandhi, some of the biggest changes throughout the history have been successful because of the use of nonviolence. And of course, nonviolence honestly demands more strength than violence, as a true act of pacifism is it requires more strength than having to inflict harm upon another person. So, as people saw that these people wanted to endure the worst for their cause, they became inspired to support them. And I believe that going forward, people should see that nonviolence and civility are the key catalyst to change, as violence is only the catalyst for things remaining as they are. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk, and I hope that you learned that nonviolence is the key to change in our society as a result.